So I'm Ray Hill and I own Origami Customs. We're a gender affirming line of swimwear and lingerie. And then we also have a community program that works to get gender affirming garments out to people who can't afford them.
How would you describe your personal relationship with clothing and philosophy with Origami Customs?
I mean, obviously, clothing is a reflection of self and like a way for us to try on different personalities and this really like tangible way of experimentation. And for me and what I do that ties in so much to gender and gender presentation. The great thing about these garments is like, A, they're just for yourself. Most of the time, the garments that I'm making are very private. And so it speaks a lot to the ways in which we don't necessarily have to perform for others, but we're really just experimenting in a very sensual way with our own like either affirmation or self-love or yeah, like trying on different gender presentations that we might not have access to in the rest of normal life. For me, I find that sometimes this really represents like a softening towards myself, like a gentleness where I can use that space to relate to myself in a way that I don't necessarily need to relate in the rest of society. And at other times, you know, these intimate garments, they really give us an ability to build kind of an armor that gets us hyped and it gets us ready to be out in a world where sometimes we're facing discrimination and sometimes we're facing people that don't accept us. And these are just tools in order to give us confidence to go out there and yeah, be weirdos, be people who disrupt the status quo in certain ways or blend in if that's what we need. The stuff that I make in particular is really like the innermost garments. Like they're really sacred to the relationship with self. It's like the first thing you're putting on in the morning. It's something that like most people aren't seeing. So it speaks a lot to the way that we self-identify and use them as like a self-love practice, but also like especially historically with lingerie items they were used in like intimate partner settings. So it has a lot to do with like our most intimate relationships and how we're exploring like passion and attraction and sexuality and all of that juicy, good stuff, which obviously comes with a lot of emotion around it, right? So these garments hold a lot of weight for the most sacred parts of our identity. You know, it's not the suit and tie that you go and put on to be out in the business world. Like you might be wearing this stuff under your work clothes, but only you know how you're identifying, how you're relating to those pieces. And then, of course, they're going to inform your choices of outerwear and also the spaces that you're in. And that was my other point that as trans people, like, what does it mean to feel affirmed in our body, in our gender? Especially the garments that I make, the gender affirming garments are often used in times before people have access to gender affirming surgeries. And so, you know, it's usually like either younger people or people who have like limited access to the ways that they want to present in the world. And so, yeah, being able to offer something to a population that's been like historically underrepresented, who like might not have the medical access that they need, like so much ties into the the way that we see these garments, the way that we use these garments. Like it really, yeah, it has so much to do with like our most sacred innermost selves.
Do you have any like personal examples or experiences of a way that maybe a garment has just been able to change the way yourself or someone else has been able to feel?
Some of the feedback I get from my clients is like so radically beautiful and affirming. Like especially now, some of the best feedback I'm getting is from parents who are working with gender diverse or trans kids and teens, and like just in general. Like I don't want to pick one particular story, but hearing how like how accepted that's become and how many people are parenting in a way that's like extremely accepting and radical. And that's been such a beautiful part of seeing my offerings get used in the world. But then I think for me particularly, I was thinking about this earlier, and I was recently when I was in Sydney, I was with the Sydney World Pride Human Rights Convention. I was invited to go for a day of speakers, And I was thinking about like how I was relating to clothing in a space that's like normally going to be quite like cis coded and like professional in a way that is not my everyday life, and how I wanted to be in that world and how I could self express in a way that felt like true to who I was, to make me feel like I was welcome there and didn't have to hide my transness, didn't have to hide my queerness, but was like representing an authentic version of myself that was then going to be celebrated in that space, and what that looked like for me. So, for example, like the under things that I chose that day. And usually for me, that means like a soft binder, something that like I feel like I can still be like expansive in, but still like affirms my gender. It was an interesting process of like choosing with that in mind, how I wanted to feel and be seen, because it's all like this mirror, right? Like it's two sides of the coin when we're out in public. It's the way that we're presenting because of the way we feel, and then it's reacting to the way that we're seen by the greater public.
That mix of both how we feel, also how we're seen. And I think that's so
Mhm.
interesting because there are these contexts, like you mentioned, right, where we maybe have a very corporate context, and it's like, how
Yeah.
can you, yeah, like sort of navigate fitting into that context where there are maybe, certain clothing expectations in a way that still like feels authentic.
It's like this dichotomy where they like really play into each other, but you can kind of you can affect one and not the other. So it's, yeah, one thing that I noticed actually during the pandemic is we had like a huge rise in orders when people were in lockdown, which I was not expecting because most businesses really struggled during lockdown. And, I thought about it for a really long time. And I think that one of the big reasons why people felt like they could access gender affirming garments was because they didn't have to go into these like coded workplace spaces, and they were just dressing how they wanted to at home. And what a shift that would have been for so many people, like especially who are like early in their transition or their gender exploration, to be able to try on garments and not be perceived in this certain way, or not have to fit a certain norm of like, this is what a workplace outfit is.
So, in addition to like you're incredible, you've got all kinds of community support initiatives. You also prioritize sustainability and ethical manufacturing. So, why were those also important to include in your business?
It's always been like an ethics-based business, a values-based business from the ground up. My theory was always that like the communities that we want to serve, which is not entirely, but is the majority, is the gender nonconforming and trans communities. That needs to start at home. So like everything that we've done has always been manufactured either by me, just wherever I've lived in the world, or now since I've created a team here in Montreal. So when we're saying it's a brand for trans people, well, we're also trans people. I'm also trans people. So like I needed to use this like oxygen mask theory and say, if we're going to support trans people, it needs to start in the way that we are like offering work to folks, which means we need to have wages that reflect the cost of living right now. We need to have like extensive healthcare benefits. We need to have like mental health care opportunities. We need to have accessibility opportunities. We need to have like paid menstrual leave. We need to like build in the things that we want to see reflected in the greater world. Because if we're not starting at home with those ethics built in, like what is even the point of putting things out into the world that are supposed to support other people? First and foremost, it was about creating that structure. And then essentially, like, I was thinking about the way that all of these systems of like labor and manufacturing are so linked. The sustainability issues are also inherently feminist issues, where we're seeing like mostly women of color shouldering the load of most of this, like what I would call like unethical, but just like normal standard manufacturing labor within the clothing industry. So like we can't really talk about sustainability in terms of like eco-friendliness without also talking about how that's a feminist issue. And as I was hiring in Montreal, realizing that like as people who have been coded female or as trans people, like we have often also like missed a lot of opportunities for upward growth because of like a male cis dominated culture, even in the fashion world. And so like training people to be skilled laborers instead of just having a production line allows opportunity for them to like earn better wages going forward and like have a skill set and develop that. You just can't separate fashion outside of the system that we live in, because all of this is global now. And I wish that we could see all of the ways in which these things are entwined. Like fashion and ecology have so much overlap, and I don't think that that's always readily apparent when people are just being consumers and purchasing clothes, and that's no fault of the consumers, it's just the way that this system has been created.
Maybe along those lines, like, do you have, if there was, I guess, some change that you'd love to see happen in the fashion industry in the next 10 years or so, or even something that's maybe snowballing and starting to happen?
There's been some really amazing radical changes lately, and seeing more businesses come forward with ethical labor practices, because I think for me that's like the kind of the pillar of sustainability and ethics. Um, but yeah, touching on what I said before, I think transparency is a main issue that I really want to see come to the forefront, because like I said, like consumers aren't given the information to make ethical choices in the way that they need to be. So really more information about like the conditions of people across the world making their garments, like realizing how tied we all are. Looking at the lifespan of clothing obviously is another huge one. Like I want to see clothing that has a lifespan of more than 6 months. And this ties into what I was saying about like the reskilling of manual laborers and like valuing people's labor in a way that gives them adequate employment and upward mobility, instead of just like a manufacturing line. Like we want to train people to make things to last and train them with these skill sets where they can like create garments that are built to stay out of landfill for a little while, because we all know like all this mass manufacturing often is just created to be thrown away, and we all know that that's like causing wreaking havoc on the environment. One of the ways in which we can start to do that is finding people who want to go back to like learning the finer skills of creation. And I think a lot of people are returning to that and wanting to work with their hands more in like an ever technological and digitizing world. I think the like return to slow fashion, like slow creation. Yeah, we don't create things on a factory line in our studio. Like everyone takes time with each garment and like looks over each person's individual measurements and thinks about like what is that body shape like? How is this person going to wear this garment? What is that going to look like for them? How do they want to feel when they receive it? You know, and really taking time and thought into each garment, and then those pieces last for their natural lifetime. And so I think if more consumers had an insight into that process, and more manufacturers and more business owners were able to train people in that way, where how things used to be created, I think that would make a huge difference.
Well, I would love to chat more, but unfortunately, we do have to keep it short for this. But
Yeah,
thank you so much for joining us and for
yeah,
sharing your experience and perspective.
it was really, really wonderful. Yeah, really valuable questions. I'm always glad when I get to have questions like this and just talk from the heart, because this is, what I really enjoy.